Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. This episode of Changing Higher Ed is sponsored by Perdea Education, a national leader in online student recruitment and enrollment services, providing institutions enrolled students risk-free on a performance-based model with no long-term contract. If your online programs could benefit from incremental online student enrollments, visit PerdeaEducation.com. That's P-E-R-D-I-A education.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our podcast welcomes back one of our favorite guests, Tom Netting, who's here to give us an update on what's going on in Washington and at the Department of Education. Tom has worked in public policy for over 28 years, advocating before Congress, federal agencies, and state governments on behalf of private institutions of higher education and post-secondary education companies. Tom's a leader in strategic policy development and advocacy in the areas of higher education, workforce development, healthcare, veterans affairs, and the procurement of federal appropriations. Tom, welcome back to the show.
Drumm, it's so good to be back with you. It's been a dog's age since we last spoke.
It has, at least 7 years or so, I would think, in dog's years. And so I know we've wanted to do this, a few months ago and stuff. There's just been so much going on. DC is less crazy than it used to be, but I think it's still kind of crazy. What's going on back there?
A frenetic pace to certainly start off the new administration. We're just past the first 100-day mark, and certainly between the Biden administration and also Congress, there has been a great deal going on. I'll start at the legislative side, building off of President Biden's requests for efforts to deal with the coronavirus as well as the economy. We've seen him put together his plan, the Build Back Better plan, that included basically 3 separate initiatives, the first of which has been enacted. That's the American Rescue Plan. That's the legislation that he proposed, and Congress moved very quickly in a partisan fashion, but moved very quickly to have enacted, which included considerable new funding in a number of areas, but for our purposes, some $39.6 billion in new funding for higher education policy, including a great deal of new financing under the higher education emergency relief programs for both institutions and students. One key differentiation was that Congress saw fit to continue to provide students with eligibility for additional emergency grants for proprietary institutions, while all other sectors of the higher education community get both institutional grants as well as student grants. So one clear distinction with a difference. As being an advocate for that community, Congress originally was not going to provide any funding for the students as well, but candidly, with discussions about the impact being across all individuals that are students attending all institutions, Congress agreed that students continue to need those protections. So we saw that, as well as the third round of funding. Quite candidly, when you think about it, from the CARES Act, going back to March of last year, December of last year, when we had the CARISA funds, which was the second tranche, and now the third tranche of funding, you're talking well over $100 billion in just funding for higher education between those 3 enacted bills. And if you look at the additional new funding and some of the proposals that are pending in the American Jobs and the American Families Plan, there's additional new money for institutions there. What is, I think, intriguing and a major focus, as it should be, is a path back to the workforce for many individuals. Unfortunately, the pandemic has brought forth with it a great deal of job loss. And one of the things that people are focused on in times of a downturn is the opportunity to maybe rehone or acquire new skills. And the legislation talks about both workforce investment and also targeted community college and minority serving institution focused support as well.
That's really good because in many countries, especially the Scandinavian countries, when someone loses their job, there is retraining that is done right there so they can move into a new job. In fact, I remember reading an article or seeing something on the internet about a Scandinavian person who lost their job and said, I'm not worried. I know I'm going to get retrained into the latest technology. It sounds like we're starting to move in that direction with this American Rescue Plan and maybe even the American Jobs Plan.
Absolutely. As Congress has held hearings, predominantly in the House, but also in the Senate, and more confirmation hearings in the Senate that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. But in both the House and in the Senate, Drumm, what they've focused on when they talk about higher education policy, right now, a lot of that is workforce related. I mean, they seem to, not that they don't traditionally go somewhat hand in glove, but now more than ever, when you hear the Education and Labor Committee Chairman, Mr. Scott, or Dr. Fox on the ranking member side, or Frederica Wilson as the subcommittee chairwoman for post-secondary ed, a lot of the focus of their dialogue and in their hearings has been on the recovery, focusing on where are the jobs and where are the opportunities for individuals to re-engage. What you're also hearing in a lot of those discussions is that they're targeting a lot of that discussion on certificate, diploma, and other credential level programs, as opposed to more than associate's degrees and baccalaureate degrees. It stands to reason, given the fact that those shorter term programs give you access to the workforce more readily, that's part of the discussion. That is not to say that they're jettisoning in any way traditional associates and baccalaureate education, but they are focused on potentially expanding Pell eligibility for short-term programs, while at the same time supporting, again, through these funding mechanisms in both the Jobs and the American Families Plan, considerable funding for community colleges, WIOA being expanded to a broader group of individuals, and the desire to see all institutions move forward with better outcomes in order to retention, placement, and completion, as well as the desire to provide additional STEM funding specifically for the minority serving institutions, your HBCUs, HSIs, and tribals as well.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And an input directly for presidents and folks who are designing curriculum. This sounds like an opportunity for folks at the universities and in leadership to make some swaps on what or changes to their foci in that moving into the job training. Now, I know Arizona State, Michael Crow, they've done these type of things in major ways with Starbucks and other other businesses like that. It sounds like there's going to be an opportunity once this thing goes through for other schools to get funding along these lines.
That's absolutely correct. Both if the $100 billion for workforce that is included in the American Jobs Plan were to go forward, there is a great deal of the money in that $100 billion that is set aside for dislocated workers. As again, like I said, the ability to go beyond just the normal areas of youth employment and youth strategies and adult learners, but make it an even broader swath in that $100 billion. In the American Jobs Plan, there's also $12 billion in proposed infrastructure spending directly for community colleges, again, to expand their bandwidth. You know that many community colleges are at capacity or maybe don't have the domiciles, the actual hard facilities to expand into some of these vocational areas where the jobs and these certification credential type programs would be. So that's provided for in the first bill. In the second bill, the American Families Plan, there is considerably more money once again for issues of targeted $63 billion for student outcomes and retention increases at institutions, $109 billion for free community college, as well as other targeted funding.
That's really, really good stuff. And I'm really glad to see this type of thing. Now, here's a question completely off the wall. What would you say to those people who say that this is just another form of socialism?
Oh, okay. Wow, you threw me a curveball there.
Sorry about that. It came to mind, and you're as good as anybody to answer this.
Nobody. I'll try and field it. I don't think we're at socialism. I do have some concerns with the fact that we seem to be moving Drumm towards institutional driven spending as opposed to student driven access to funds to then have them choose the institution and the program that best meets their needs. If you're sending more money to just the community colleges versus all of the spectrum of higher ed, certainly that enhances and improves their capabilities. But what does that do for the large number of private nonprofit institutions? You know, my penchant for the proprietary sector, who not only is, again, set aside in a number of these congressional proposals, but in the American Rescue Plan had reforms on the 90-10 rule that are going to, again, probably limit their ability to serve our nation's military, which I don't think serves military well, and certainly other lower socioeconomic classes of individuals that they fill a need and a void for, and I don't think can be fully embraced if that sector were to go away by community colleges or some of the other forms of minority serving institutions. But I don't think it's socialism as much as education has been underfunded for quite a while. We've never seen $100 billion in emergency spending, but we certainly had never seen a pandemic before. Mm-hmm. Are all of those monies going to be well spent? That is one of the things that I'm going to tell you that I, as an advocate, am going to talk about going forward for all sectors. With this historic investment and potentially more to come, I hope that there is equal scrutiny of all sectors of higher education and how it's used as part of that process. Socialism, probably not. Investment needed and hopefully well worth it, and we see the dividends down the road. Yes.
Yeah. And the big challenge is most higher ed institutions, forget about the Harvards, the Yales, the Ivies, who have huge, surpluses from tuition, from endowments, et cetera. Most higher ed institutions are running pretty much even. If they take a big hit to their budget like COVID did without external funding, they're not going to be able to stay in business. And for them to make significant changes, it requires a COVID type event to get people motivated to make a change. I think the worst thing that higher ed could do right now is say, oh, we've got this extra money. We're just going to go back to doing what we did before. That is not going to work. And that is the wrong decision to make.
And you know this from all of the work that you do in distance education. I think we've reached a tipping point. By its very design, institutions were forced to consider hybrid methods of education in order to continue providing education throughout the pandemic. That's given a lot of entities the ability to dip their toe into what hybrid or online education looks like, including in areas that traditionally we may not have believed that type of education could be provided. I'm talking about a number of the skilled trades. It's kind of hard to work on an engine, whether that be an aviation engine or an auto diesel engine, from your computer, but they have found ways to adapt, and there are ways in which to deal with that. Beauty and wellness and so many other occupations that, again, are at that credential and license level where you still need a license in order to be able to go out and officially work in some of these occupations. So all of that is melding into it as well. Where I was going with this is I think that you're going to see even more of a focus on online education. I think that you're going to see more innovation and adaptability. And again, the regulations as well as the statute need to continue to trend in that direction as well.
Yeah. How many conversations did we have about the Higher Education Act? And yes, it's coming, it's coming. Oh, not so fast.
Yeah. 2008, we're at, 13 years and counting?
13 years. And of course, we had just as much technology back then as we do now, right? Ha.
The interesting thing is some would attest that or think that we did, or at least that there were the fledgling portions of it. And you think about some of the roots, correspondence education. Certainly we've gone far beyond what was the traditional correspondence education with distance ed online and all of its many synchronous and asynchronous varieties. But, I think it truly is the future. I think that, again, the pandemic, for all of the ills and frustrations it's also brought the opportunity, like you said earlier, and I would agree, for potential true tipping point in education policy, not only in its delivery, but in the thinking. And again, like you said, and I will echo from my own vantage point, I hope that this $100 billion is used as well as it can be in order to truly advance higher education, as opposed to just simply doing business as usual.
Well, maybe the next time that you've got one of these large names by, you can whisper in their ear and say something like accountability, innovation, accountability.
It's coming. Again, Senator Murray, as the chairwoman of the Help Committee, as well as Senator Burr as the ranking member. Again, I already mentioned Dr. Scott, Mr. Scott and Dr. Fox. Accountability is part of what they're discussing. But again, it's tied up right now more so in trying to get us out of the pandemic and what recovery looks like. I think enforcement of an oversight and review of the utilization of the funds is legislation and directives obviously yet to come. We've only just now seen the first year of the HERF funding basically come to a conclusion, but we're seeing the HERF 2 and the HERF 3 funds now starting to come forward. And again, given the fact that those funds will run through another 2 years, in essence, it's going to take a while to, again, oversee those funds. Let's just make sure that we do it while it's happening and not look back at the end and say, woulda, coulda, shoulda.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think, and I thank you for this little detour on what we were going to talk about. It's been really interesting for me, and I hope for their listeners as well. Education appointments. We have a new Secretary of Education. We have a new Deputy Secretary. There's a number of jobs still pending out there. So what's going on with that? And how is the potential impact from those confirmations and people in those jobs?
Brought up another key sensitivity here in Washington, which is while we do have Miguel Cardona as our new Secretary of Education and Cindy Martin as Deputy Secretary, there's a number of the key positions that are still left unfulfilled and even unappointed by the Biden administration. I'll start with the one that everybody is talking about here in town that we still don't even know who the potential nominee is, and that's for the Office of General Counsel in the Department of Education. A key slot to be filled, to be sure, because all regulations run through the Office of the General Counsel. And while there are very, very astute individuals that I consider colleagues and even friends in some instances over in the department, without that pinnacle individual, they're kind of in a precarious position to try and move regulations forward when the authoritarians that also speak for the administration are not yet in place. Similarly, we have seen that James Quall has been nominated to be the undersecretary. That would be the highest ranking higher ed person, bringing it back to higher ed once again, within the Department of Education. James has a steep history both on the Hill as well as in the former Biden administration. He's also spent time out in the private sector with TICAS and a couple of other organizations. So he has a great deal of depth and breadth in higher education policy. He went through the Senate confirmation process. The Senate Help Committee confirmed him for full committee consideration. I believe that he will be well received and confirmed probably this week by the Senate. The goal was and still is to have him confirmed this week before they go out for the Memorial Day recess. The interesting one from Terrell Owens from the old statements of better get your popcorn ready. If you're looking for a hearing that might be a little bit more contentious, the nomination of Assistant Secretary for the Office of Civil Rights of Catherine Lamont is probably going to be a little bit more contentious than any of the prior other nominees within the Department of Education. That is not to say that Ms. Lamont is not a credit in her own right. She is a very strong advocate for the positions she believes in, but with that strong will and that presence, you sometimes can ruffle feathers. So it'll be interesting to see how, in particular, some of the Republicans who remember an exchange between her and former Chairman Alexander that didn't go so well when she basically, when asked, how is it and who gave you the authority to do certain things, Ms. Lamont said, well, you did, Senator, and that didn't go over real well.
So we're looking at more Rand Paul, Anthony Fauci type moments?
At a different level, but yeah. So some of, I think Mr. Burr is going to certainly question some of the level to which there is bipartisan and opportunity for interplay. The same kind of discussions that were had with Mr. Cardona and Ms. Martin and Mr. Quall. in terms of bipartisan relationships, the ability to get feedback and commentary on both sides of the aisle, but then also the ability when in a very, very 50-50 Senate and a very limited House where everything is coming to more towards a centrist view, is she willing to come to some of those centrist views in her direction of the Office of Civil Rights, or will she remain kind of an outlier to the liberal left? And again, keep in mind, she's appointed by President Biden, so she'll be following a lot of his agenda, but how do you make that work with the compromises of both the statute and the regulations that follow? And there are big ticket items on her plate or on that particular plate. We all know what we've lived through and experienced with race relations and cultural issues, which falls under the Office of Civil Rights. And another big ticket item important to Chairwoman Murray, as well as many, many others in the House and Senate, is the Title IX regulations and the desire to reform the regulations that went into effect last August by the Trump administration, and what many believe went too far to protect the accused as opposed to the accuser or the victim.
Which brings us right to the regulatory updates.
Pretty good segue, wasn't it?
That was a smooth transition, Tom. I appreciate that.
I try. The big news on the regulatory front is just that. The department has announced in the past month, and as recently as today, officially, 2 different sets of negotiated rulemaking. For those of you unfamiliar, that's the process by which, or at least virtual hearings, one of these will go through a negotiated rulemaking, Title IX will not. But the department has the ability to, in development of regulations, seek input from those that are impacted entities. And to do so, one of the first things the Office of Civil Rights put out was this notice of a virtual hearing that will take place over 4 days from the 7th through the 11th of June, where any and all interested parties have the opportunity to register on a website in the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education to express their views on the current regulation and any changes or modifications that they recommend should come. Brief reminder, Drumm, you'll recall when the Trump administration went through reforming the Obama administration's former regs, the notice of proposed rulemaking that they developed for those changes received over 123,000 comments. So this is not an issue that goes unnoticed by many, many different quarters and many, many different groups. So we anticipate a great deal of interaction on the Title IX proposals over that 4-day window and maybe even longer. That is the precursor for the potential ability for the department to take all of that information and the Biden administration and the Democrats' concerns with the reforms that the Trump administration put forward, go write a new regulatory proposal, send that through the notice of proposed rulemaking, to get additional comments, and ultimately come out with a new final regulation. Again, seeking to make significant modifications to the Title IX regulations that only went into effect last August. From a school perspective, you can imagine this is almost like a scene from The Exorcist where their heads are spinning all the way around, because no sooner do they get one set of regulations and one set of significant changes to the process, the policies and procedures, and the expected requirements for compliance. And now we're back into negotiations to potentially turn it 180 degrees from where it was.
It's called whiplash.
Yeah. And then you add to that the fact that for issues related to broader Title IV federal student financial aid, the new administration just announced officially in the Federal Register today that there are 14 issues that they hope to address, specifically highlighting a number of issues that deal with student loans, everything from public service loan forgiveness to disability protections, a number of accountability provisions, many of them focused once again on the proprietary sector. We know that the Democrats, while in the minority, had major concerns with Ms. DeVos and some of the elimination of the gainful employment rule, modifications to the borrower repayment requirements, and their policies and procedures that stem from those regulations that don't sit well with Democrats. All of that, as well as broader institutional accountability, financial responsibility standards, are open for review. And at the conclusion of that, the department also requests for additional information on issues related to outcomes, whether that be placement, retention, or other aspects of loan repayment or things that can be done. And I think that, again, that kind of falls under the auspice of accountability. Keep in mind, one of the major metrics used for institutional quality for literally since 1989, or actually even before that, is cohort default rates. And now with the 18 months and trending elimination of any obligations for students to repay their loans, we're now going to have at least a 1 to 2 year period where the cohort default rates are going to be hard to calculate, if not irrelevant, because all students have been given, and rightfully so, don't get me wrong. In the pandemic, I think it has been the right thing to do to give relief to students in terms of their repayment obligations, no interest accrual, and then also protections from some of the negative consequences if you haven't repaid. But what does that look like going forward in terms of these quote unquote quality indicators? Many people don't believe that cohort default rates were ever really a measure of institutional quality, but more directly the socioeconomic status of the individuals drawing down their loans. Well, more people are drawing down loans. We still need to make sure that those loans are being repaid. Again, are we at a tipping point of changes in what the determinations and what the metrics and what things that both Congress and the department look at to judge academic quality? We've seen the advent of the College Navigator site and the scorecard show information on potential earnings for all individuals at all institutions and all disciplines. Does that mean gainful employment is now something that truly extends with the same potential eligibility limitations to all sectors of higher education and not just the proprietary sector? The data is certainly out there for all now. Why would you limit it just to one? We look at things like completion and retention rates. And again, we see President Biden putting forth $62 billion. Seems to me that might be a recognition that those rates need to come up. But again, if you're going to judge people on those, why are we giving money to some sectors in order to improve those rates while holding other entities potentially accountable of loss of access for their students based on those same numbers that are on par with, or in some instances higher?
Well, I had a conversation, 2 years ago with Diane Howard-Jones, who, we both know. And her vision was to take the college scorecard and take it to the next level as a substitute for gainful employment and apply it across the board. And that to me seems like a very reasonable approach. To me, gainful employment should not be limited to the for-profit sector. It ought to be for all colleges. And if you've got a scorecard like what she was proposing, and phase one is really in place now, then that's a good metric to judge people by and have accountability.
Agreed. And you're seeing a lot of think tanks, and mine's a hell of a lot brighter than mine. I was just with last week Jason Delisle from American Enterprise Institute and Lindsay Burke from the Heritage Foundation. Granted, somewhat in those two particular instances more Republican leaning than Democratic leaning, but their comments were still, I think, valid regardless of your political persuasion. And that is, for far too long, we didn't have the data. So we used crude metrics that were probably not as effective as they should have been, like cohort default rates. Now that we have the outcomes data, and we have it for all types of institutions, and we have a lot of these tracking mechanisms in place, if you really want to judge institutions, there's the capability out there to do it for all. And that may mean that you still have differentiation in terms of what the pressure points or what the indicators are for the various different sectors. But let's be clear about the fact that there's data out there. If you want to judge quality and effectiveness, outcomes measures might be the best way to go. And there seems to be enough of that out there for all sectors.
Yeah. And here's a unique idea. Make this part of the accreditation metrics that institutions have to go through to be eligible for Title IV funding.
I think accreditors might have a little bit of pushback, only in as much as they feel like a lot of the oversight of institutions has been thrust upon them. I think they would welcome the opportunity for outcomes and other measures to be part of what they do. And in fact, many accreditors are doing more of that. But if In turn, the department took over other responsibilities as parts of the triad. We certainly know that many states have outcomes measures as part of their assessment, as well as the accreditors. So, yeah, I think that, again, as we look at the broader context of this, I think that there is a very unique opportunity for a lot of change in the delivery of higher education, but also the oversight and assessment. It will be interesting to see how that unfolds and how it plays out, but also assurances that, again, as we talked about earlier in today's podcast, is it going to be institutional, or is it going to be, as it traditionally has, student driven? In the past, 90% of the funding has gone directly to the students, and the students are at choice. Now it seems like some of the proposals are focusing on lifting up certain institutions or certain groups, and that's different. And we'll see whether or not that continues to play out as Congress contemplates this in great nature and what comes back.
Well, this is great. We're close to the end of the time. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, as I always do, Tom. What are the three biggest things that university presidents and boards should be thinking about with these changes that are going on in Washington?
Well, interestingly enough, we haven't even talked yet about the very important proposal that still continues to be up here in Congress with the Biden administration, and that is loan debt cancellation. Progressive's proposal to relieve at least $50,000 in student debt. The original Biden proposal to relieve $10,000 in debt, and several hearings up here on Capitol Hill around that issue. It continues to be the proverbial football being pushed back and forth from one end of Pennsylvania Avenue to the other. One of the major reasons for that is if the president were to do it, it would still be a cost to the federal government, but it would not be one that Congress has to try and address through their budget process. If Congress enacts legislation to do this, depending on what the level is, you're talking about $395 billion and more that would then have to be specifically offset with other cuts or other changes. So that's one issue that I think all college presidents are obviously watching. You have a lot of discussions around whether or not that will be a regressive set of circumstances. The goal is to help all individuals, obviously, with college debt, but many economists and others question whether that'll help more individuals that have the ability to pay than the lower socioeconomic groups that are trying to be lifted out of that obligation. So it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic continues to go forward. We'll tell you, and you and I talked about this before, and I know it'll be part of your newsletter, another area that I think institutions need to be looking at into the future is the area of cybersecurity as it relates to the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and also NIST 800-171. All institutions, the department put forward under the Trump administration, but this will be carried through into the Biden administration because of personally identifiable information and all of the, literally $17 trillion in federal student financial aid that are tied to students in higher ed. The ability to protect that information is forcing new regulatory requirements, which will require institutions to look at a much broader, more in-depth IT protection system at their institutions. It's not going to be easy to do, and it's not going to be cheap. Last but certainly not least, the other thing that I think that institutions and college presidents need to be focused on is the fact that, and it's gotten very little attention, is that also in 2023, 2024, the FAFSA simplification legislation that was enacted last year, the kind of gold watch for Senator Alexander, which included not only taking the FAFSA and simplifying it from over 100 plus questions down to 20 to 30, but it significantly changed the determinations of how estimated family contributions and needs analysis are going to be done. In the past, it had a number of different bells and whistles to the process. Now it is simply going to be the individuals based on certain parameters, dependent or independent, with variables in there, and it will rate it based on percentages in relation to poverty. That's going to considerably change a lot of and probably make more individuals Pell eligible, more individuals eligible for the maximum Pell or some portions there under it. That's good news for the borrower because that was potentially limits further debt. But how all of that plays out and how a new system that the department is having to put in place to accommodate that looks at earnings in relationship to eligibility are things that we're going to be dealing with in the future as well.
Wow. Well, those are three definite important things for presidents to be looking at. So Tom, what's next? You have been just absolutely swamped. I know C-SPAN, who you work with, has their annual conference coming up here in a matter of a couple of months. What's going on with you?
Just keeping busy. Like I said, we all talk about the fact that, and I think it's somewhat cliche to sometimes say, I don't think I've ever been busier. But truly, this has been a very, very busy time, a lot of different things going on. I don't see it slowing down anytime soon, Drumm. Again, those negotiated rulemakings that we alluded to will take us well into the winter of 2021 and likely into the early winter of 2022. And then the process that unfolds after that. We certainly have these pieces of legislation that are still working their way through Congress, and probably have some other things that will be coming forward as well. Again, short-term Pell eligibility is one of the areas that I'm focusing on for eligibility for students across all sectors. I think that will probably try and be slid into one of the other packages on the Build Back Better plan, whether that be American Jobs or American Families plan, and just representing schools, trying to keep them informed through opportunities like this. It has been far too long. I'm glad we got together now, and I hope that we have the opportunity to do more of these because it's going to be a busy summer and fall.
Well, I look forward to it, my friend. Let's check back in a couple of months and see where things are. How's that sound?
Fair deal. Thank you so much for allowing me to be with you again today, Drumm.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, my friend. You take care.
You too.
Thanks for listening this week. And a special thank you to this week's special guest, Tom Netting, for giving us his Washington update. Always a pleasure to have you on the show, Tom. I also want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, Perdea Education. Visit PerdeaEducation.com to learn how they can help grow your online student enrollment through a performance-based model with no risk or long-term contracts to your institution. Our next guest is Dr. Anthony Wuta, Provost of Howard University. Anthony will be joining us to discuss Howard's two most recent ways they're transforming their curriculum, with a partnership with Amazon to do data management credentials and their Women's Center. It's going to be a great show, and I hope you'll all be able to join us.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.